ACNFers, The Frontrunner, The Life of Steve Prefontaine, out by Mariner Books, is available for pre-order. I've gotten some nice notes from people who pre-ordered the book, and I love seeing that. It means a lot to me. You can visit the bookseller of your choice, online or in person, and plunk down your $32.99 or more. Everything helps. Every author you know under the sun begs for pre-orders, and I think we need to build in budget lines for our favorite writers and our friends who have pre-orders because they mean more than the actual buying of the book itself. I know it's the same thing, but it sort of is, but it isn't, or whatever. We only have so many dollars at our disposal, so just consider it. Promotional support for the podcast is brought to you by the Power of Narrative Conference in Boston, Massachusetts, my home state, or the state I grew up in, celebrating its 26th year, the conference. And it's in a month, 28th, 29th. Hundreds of journalists from around the world are descending on Boston. You can hear from the likes of Susan Orlean, Connie Schultz, Dan Zach, and Connie Chung. Listeners to this podcast get 15% off your enrollment fee if you use the CNF15 code. So visit combeyond.bu.edu and use that CNF15 code.
It was so propulsive. I think I stayed up until 2 a.m. reading this diary, and the whole time was messaging my friends like, guys, I can't believe what I'm reading. This is amazing. It felt like a dream.
Oh, hey, CNFers, I know this is insane. 2 episodes in a single day. It had to happen. I've got so many in the backlog. We recorded an interview like 3 months ago. Like, what the hell's going on? I know. That's the nature of this sometimes. Also, it's the Atavistian time of the month, so there are some spoilers here for this amazing story for this month. Visit magazine.atavist.com and read From Antarctica with Love, and maybe consider subscribing to the Atavist. I don't get any kickbacks, so you know I'm good for it, CNFers. So this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. This week, or this month for the Atavist, we have Allegra Rosenberg. She's here to talk about her piece, a year in the making, that follows the tender relationship between Lieutenant, and I might butcher this, Harry Pennell and Edward Atkinson. They being British Navy men and it being the early 20th century, it was a love largely kept secret. But it was something not altogether uncommon for these polar explorers who spent years together on dangerous expeditions. I'll give Allegra a better intro when it comes time to hear from her. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Meara.com. Hey, there. You can follow my anti-social media page, blog posts, and you can sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Cool recommendations. It goes up to 11. I have historically offered a monthly happy hour for newsletter subscribers, but when attendance is 1 or none, as has been the case of late, I begin to think that maybe it's not worth my time, or clearly others. If nobody shows up to the party, do you keep sending out invites? Might be time to sunset it, or move it to Patreon, where you can go to patreon.com/CNFpod and consider supporting the show with a few clams. First, we're going to hear from lead editor Jonah Ogles. And it was one of his all-time favorite stories, Allegra's story here. So you know you're in for a really good slice of the editor's table. There's a parting shot this week about perhaps how to freshen up the podcast. I'm not just talking deodorant. Maybe it's just some renovations. I don't know. Here's Jonah riff. Come across most of your editorial revelations when you're looking to crack a code? Like, when do those tend to come to you?
I think it takes a certain number of reads. I really try to read a piece without making notes the first time. I can't tell you how often, like, I leave a comment and then the next graph addresses the comment that I just left, you know, if I just dive right in. So I think you first have to, like, take stock of what you have. But in terms of like those light bulb moments, they're just not super predictable. Sometimes it's really obvious as you're reading a piece, like, oh God, this is great, and this is like the thing that we need to really emphasize or move up higher in the piece. And sometimes it only happens after like 4 or 5 reads where I'm like beating my head against the wall because I can't figure out how to get the story to click the way I want it to. And sometimes it doesn't even happen then, and it's not until I like talk to Sayward or Peter and say, "Oh my God, like I just can't figure out how to make this thing really pop in the story." And it's like an outside pair of eyes who can finally say, "Oh, well, what if you try this?" And then usually like I recognize that somewhere in the dark recesses of my brain that thought had been bouncing around. It just hadn't made its way past like the slush of all the other thoughts.
And with Allegra's story, I love that she had initially pitched you something, a while ago that was rejected, but you encouraged her to pitch again. So when you received a second pitch, what drew you to her this pitch that would be her Antarctica love story, if you will?
There were a lot of things that I liked about this story. I mean, first of all, like I love a good expedition disaster story. Like that was sort of encoded into my DNA at Outside. So I was intrigued. I was intrigued by that aspect. But what I liked about this story is like it's an adventure disaster story, kind of, but it's more it's also this like love story about this relationship that grows between these two men. That's a completely different type of story than your classic adventure disaster. And it's in an era when like sexuality might not even be a word that they're aware of, or they're certainly not thinking of it in the way we do today. There's that aspect as well, that's kind of this historical look at what it was like to live as what we now call a gay man or a bi man, but a long time ago, in an era before that was much part of the conversation, and yet at the same time was like more or less commonplace in the Navy. Like right away it was a story we wanted to work on because it had a lot of different things happening in it that all made it sort of interesting in like a thematic way. But at the heart of it, she just had really good material to work with, because it's a famous expedition. She has lots of source material to work with on that front. But she also has Pennell's letters and diaries, which he's just like a great diarist, like he's a good writer. He sort of wears his heart on his sleeve or on the page, and it just makes for this story where you feel like you're really, really close to the characters in the midst of this famous narrative, but getting a picture of it that you've never had before.
Allegra had a draft of something like 26,000 words, was it just writing in a fever dream, kind of writing through grief too, since her father had recently passed away. And she wrote a really monstrous draft, and eventually you cut this down by half. So as you're reading it, what are the questions you're asking yourself to get it down to a more manageable, efficient and energetic read?
Yeah. Well, it starts off with literally like I'd start by by leaving comments faster and slower, and that's like it. And that's just, those aren't for like the writer to ever see. That's just for me. And what that means is like I started to get a little bored here, and in another place like I want to know more about this. Like we're moving through this material too quickly. I don't really understand what's happening, but I'm curious and I want to know more. That sounds so simple, but that's where I start. So the parts where I want it to move faster, I I cut it down. I try to distill it to a sentence or two if it's a paragraph, or maybe to a paragraph if it's a section. Once you start actually like trimming things down, all of a sudden you realize like there are just tangents in the story that aren't necessary. And I will say, like, the editing of an Atavist piece is different than a book. I think most of the things I cut from her draft, for example, would be like, there were things I cut that could be whole chapters in a book, and probably should be if she ever writes one about this. You reach a point where you sort of have your central story, and you, especially as the story moves on, you want to stay as close to that as you can. So especially like in the latter half of the piece, or the last third of a piece, I really don't like moving away from the action at all. I mean, I'm sure I talk about this with writers all the time. Like, once we get towards the end, we are just staying close to our main characters with like the main plot line, so that readers feel sort of propelled toward the end. I don't want any reader to like get 75% of the way through and be like, oh boy, they're like launching into new subjects here. Like, maybe, I don't know if I have time to finish this. I'm going to step away. So yeah, I get more brutal as the piece goes on.
With these stories, also, I always love getting that a snapshot of a unique challenge that you faced with this particular piece.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the cutting on this one, I mean, maybe Allegra feels differently, but it didn't feel particularly like difficult. Although I tend to like cutting, so that's there's probably a lot of bias in that. But I think one of the things that Allegra and I were in frequent conversation about was, like, there's this other relationship, right, in the story. So you've got Pennell, or it might be Pennell, I don't know how it's pronounced, but in Atkinson is sort of your main love story. But there's also these other two guys on the ship, one of whom like confesses to his fellow like crewmates, or a couple of them, that he feels that he was born a woman, and that he's not his true self. Dennis Lilly is a name, and he becomes quite close with another character in the story. That was something that like I found a little distracting as we moved through the piece. Not because it's not interesting. I would expect like multiple chapters on it in a book. It just came up later in the story, and I wanted to stay close. But Allegra, I think, rightly made the point that like, no, this is important to sort of talking about this subculture that we're diving into, where men in the Navy had these relationships with each other, that may have been sexual, that may have been romantic, which may have been purely platonic, but maybe bordering on one of the others. And she felt it was important to include it, and so we had to find ways of doing that so that it didn't feel like readers had necessarily been pulled out of the main narrative, but were still given enough space about it that they could make sense of it. She had a very keen sense of what she wanted, what she felt like needed to be in the piece. And so we had conversations about how to get those things in a way that felt natural, and like it wasn't going to trip the reader up.
Very nice. Well, I like hearing that thought process and the questions you're asking for the job at hand. So that's always wonderful to hear your side of these things.
Like, that's an important part of the edit process, is having those conversations. Like, one thing I wish writers maybe recognized a little more is like, there's not, and I'm probably undercutting myself, some writer will use this against me someday, but like, there's not necessarily like a right way of doing it, or a wrong way of doing it. And obviously that's a broad statement, but what I mean is like, a writer writes a piece with their own sensibility and their own sense of story, and what they like and what they don't like. An editor is doing that exact same thing, and it doesn't mean that like, my way is the right way, or that my way is better than any other editors. But when you're a writer and an editor working on a story, it's a lot like being in a relationship. It's like, okay, we are trying to make this story work within our relationship, so like things that the writer and I both agree are working, great. Things we both agree aren't working, awesome. But then there are all these other things that you've sort of got to, you have to have conversations about, and you're basically trying to convince each other, well, this is important to me for this reason, or like I really don't want it in here for that reason. There's a give and take to it in the way there is in any other relationship, where you say, okay, like I can live with that, but maybe I want this other thing in there too. And that's just part of the process. I think writers sometimes get frustrated, when like I don't necessarily see see the things the same way they do. It's important to just keep talking about it and try to figure out a way forward through it, which I think, like, Allegra and I hope she's happy with it. I'm thrilled with the piece. Like, this is one of my favorite pieces ever, and Allegra was great to work with, and I thought we had a really great dialogue about all of those types of things as we worked on the story.
Yeah. So it's a great piece, and as always great to get your side of the table, Jonas. So we're going to kick it over to Allegra now, and as always, thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brendan.
Time to hear from Allegra. She's a journalist, historian, writer, writes about media, tech, AI, science, music, travel, business, internet culture, art. Jeez. She's working on a book set to come out by Norton, not sure when, about fandom, and she's super into polar exploration. Her work has appeared in National Geographic, Wired, Slate, The Atlantic, now The Atavist. Her website is Allegra, with 2 L's, Rosenberg.com. And you can find ways to follow her on Bluesky, Instagram, Substacky, YouTube, LinkedIn, etc. Great conversation here. Just about how she went about it. When she knew she had the story, she had enough to formulate the pitch and get it going. How she just went about it. How she went about the work. And why she loved the story so much. So here we are. It's time to hear from Allegra. Like, when you need advice, or if you're stuck, what's the kind of advice that you typically seek?
Well, I would say that for my whole life, my creative mentor was my dad, and that's someone that I would always go to for encouragement. But unfortunately, he passed away last year. And so it's really been a journey of me trying to move through life without that sort of, unconditional creative support. He was a musician, he was a creative himself. And so, that's one of the things that I have ahead of me. It's a big job to try and replace, that kind of relationship. But of course, you need, so many different people to replace just one person in that case. So it's definitely a journey that I'm on.
And when you had those kind of conversations, what was it in particular you might have sought?
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, he was my biggest fan. And, who knows whether that was because he was just my dad, but he really was like, you are an amazing writer. Like, you can do this. Whenever I sort of fell into self-doubt or, wasn't believing in my ability, he would be there to back me up. I had a Substack, or I mean, I still have it, but he would read every single thing I put out for my Substack and send me this big, long comment about what he liked about it, what worked really well. And so that kind of encouragement was so much a big part of why I felt able to pursue writing as a career.
How do you wrestle with self-doubt?
Well, I know what I'm good at. So if I'm ever like trying something new that's super challenging, I just make sure that there are other areas of my life that I'm more confident in, that I'm moving forward in, so I can get those wins somewhere else, and then, keep up with the challenge and maybe some of the setbacks in another area of my life where I'm trying to do something new.
And what might you identify as the kind of stories that really drive you?
I mean, I am interested in the human stories that are inside, other stories. So, stories of, in this case, exploration, and science and war. But in other cases, I'm interested in like the history of technology and the history of communication. What are the sort of human relationships and stories that are inside these bigger sort of arcs of history? I grew up reading Mental Floss magazine and Wired magazine, and all these stories from the most fascinating parts of human history and culture. And I was always super interested in the people behind it and like, what their lives were like, the lives of inventors and public figures, but like, all the super interesting stuff that, maybe isn't the sort of headline. What were people really like?
And, for you,
Mhm.
what are some of those things that lit you up, that kind of put you on this path?
I would say that I don't know if it's quite like that for me because I'm always motivated first by a topic or subject and then the desire to communicate my enthusiasm about that topic. I come from a fandom background. I've worked in the entertainment industry, and when I was working with bands and musical artists, it was always, starting from a place of me being a huge fan and then putting myself in a position to communicate to other people in the industry, labels and stuff like that, why this band is good, why you should sign them. And I know best because I'm sort of their biggest fan. So I love taking on that role of being this sort of communicator of enthusiasm and helping interest in something spread. And that has carried over into my writing career where I'll find something super interesting or something that I think is super compelling. And what my job as a writer then is to portray or to convey that compelling nature to a wider audience. But some authors that I've really been enjoying lately, especially like I've been reading a lot of historical fiction because I'm super interested in how the facts can be used to support, interpretations of stories. So I'd say that two authors who've been really important in that realm lately for me have been Hilary Mantel and Pat Barker, who are two British historical fiction writers who I've really been loving their work lately.
Yeah, a moment ago, kind of what the crux of what you were saying, of almost being like a hype man of sorts for a
Yeah.
story you're into. Like, that's kind of the crux of writing a query letter and getting an editor excited about it. And so
Right.
just that, as you were formulating, say, the query or the pitch for this piece for the Atavist, what did that look like? What went into that for you?
Sure. Well, I have obviously known about the Atavist for a long time, and I think I had seen that their pitch call was up on Study Hall, which is a fantastic resource for freelance writers that I really recommend that everybody subscribe to. It is so worth the money. It is how I've gotten some of my biggest stories accepted, including this one. I saw that they had an open pitch call. I sent over a pitch for a personal essay style memoir piece that I had been thinking of doing, which wasn't accepted, but I got a really kind rejection letter from Jonah Ogles at the Atavist. He said, this isn't what we're looking for, but feel free to pitch us again.
So I went and found a rejection email that Jonah wrote to me on July 2nd, 2018, when he was still at Outside magazine. Hey, Brendan, thanks for thinking of us. I love a good mystery, but this pitch suffers from something that a lot of pitches struggle with, posing questions without offering answers. For us to be interested in a pitch like this, we'd need some additional reporting that made it clear that we'd be able to tell readers what's actually happening. So I'm going to say no to this. But again, thanks for thinking of Outside, and good luck. Aw.
And then as it happened a couple months later, I had reached a certain point in my research for this story, which had been ongoing independently, not even really planning to do anything with it, but just doing this research since the top of 2023. I'd reached a point about a year after that, so February of 2024, where I was like, I think this story is ready to be seen by a wider audience. I think I have all the material that I'm probably ever going to get, and I really want to tell this story. So I'd spent, it was probably like 2 days laboring over this pitch, preparing to send it to Jonah, really making sure that I conveyed the access, the work that I'd already done, the fact that I at that point had been introduced via email to some family members, some descendants of the people involved. And I had another research trip already planned that I could incorporate into, an Atavist version of the story. And I just sent it off. I was just like crossing my fingers. And I was super lucky because Jonah previously worked at Outside magazine, which is a travel magazine, and was already familiar with the story of Captain Scott's expedition, which is sort of the background to this more personal story. So I was lucky that he had the context for why this was such an interesting and compelling story to tell.
How did this story get on your radar in the first place?
It's a great story. I have been interested in polar exploration for probably like 4 or 5 years at this point. It was like my pandemic hobby, and it just turned into such a huge part of my life over the past few years. And I got in the habit of reading diaries of these explorers just for fun. And because there's a bunch that have been published, there are a bunch that are available online through museums and archives. During the pandemic, a lot of museums, especially in far flung parts of the world, began making a lot of their material available digitally for researchers because it was hard for researchers, obviously, to travel to archives. So, especially in Australia and New Zealand, they started uploading a bunch of their stuff. And Pennell's diary was one of these PDFs that was uploaded. And I came across it one day. I was like, I'd really love to read another one of these great diaries from this expedition. I think I've read them all. I don't think that there's any left. And I came across this one and I was like, I think this is going to be my evening reading. So I just sat down and started reading this, like 400-page handwritten PDF. And as I read it, this story just unfolded completely organically because you're reading it sort of week by week in Pennell's handwriting. The story of him getting the job on the expedition, getting on the ship, meeting Atkinson, saying goodbye, seeing him again, missing him. And it just all sort of, it was so propulsive. I think I stayed up until 2 a.m. reading this diary, and the whole time was messaging my friends like, guys, I can't believe what I'm reading. This is amazing. It felt like a dream. And that's when I knew that there was this story there that hadn't been told.
Isn't it crazy? Like you come across a story like, how has this not been told? And you feel like you're in on this secret and you're like, holy shit, I got to get this. I don't know.
Yeah.
I got to get on this. I got to get this secret out, but maybe before someone else gets it. But I'm like, you feel like you're sitting on something that is just so hot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it was that really only 2 or 3 people had ever read this diary in full before. And I happened to know both of them. So they're other members of the polar research community. And for various reasons, neither of them had chosen to publish this specific part of the story. I think because one of them had read it quite a long time ago in the scheme of things and didn't feel that it would be appropriate. And another one of them also read it a while ago and just it wasn't quite relevant to the project that they were working on that they had read it for. But he's quite an obscure member of the expedition. He wasn't in the shore party. He doesn't come up a lot in Cherry Garrett's Worst Journey in the World. So there was a lack of interest. And then there's also the fact that obviously his family knew of his sexuality, as it were. And, that was just something that was known in the family that no academic or researcher had really been interested in.
So you read through this diary, and so what happens next for you?
Well, that's when I sort of start the process of compiling it into, sort of a semi-private blog post because I want to share this with the research community. I have kind of like the opposite of hoarding when it comes to research. I'm always so eager to share with people because I want to, again, communicate that enthusiasm and communicate that joy of a discovery. So I pretty quickly whipped up a blog post with some of the best quotes from the diary. And I didn't even go looking for further sources. The other 2 researchers I mentioned, I reached out to them and I said, do you know anything further? Like, I think my main question at that point, because I only had Pennell's point of view, was like, do you think this was a reciprocated relationship? And both of them said, like, yes, insofar as much as repressed Edwardian men can reciprocate something like this, they very much did love each other, which was, wonderful to hear. And so then after that first blog post had gone up, that's when I decided to get that other side of the story, go out to other sources beyond this original diary and see what else I could find.
So how do you track down the family and people that can bolster the narrative even more than your initial research?
Yeah, I mean, well, they commented on the blog post. They were like, yeah, that's Harry Pennell. Like, if you ever want to chat about him with us, like, email. And I'm like, okay.
Oh, wow.
And they also, the 2 other researchers I mentioned had also both been in touch with members of the family. So, everyone in the polar world knows of each other. It's a very small community. And so it was not that hard to make those connections.
So as you're starting to gather that information, at what point does the photochemical development of this story start to really take shape for you?
It's the thing. It's like, as a reader of historical fiction, I'm sort of well practiced in an imaginative sense of spinning up a whole story based off a sentence that I read, right?
Hmm.
Like, doing primary source research and sort of there's an involuntary sort of narrative building that tends to happen in my mind when I'm reading, something like this. And I sort of see it like a movie, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, just some of the imagery in that original diary. I mean, Pennell's this fantastic writer. One of the things that made this story so easy to write is that he's a much more expressive writer than most men of his generation. I would say Captain Scott is another example of a writer who is like incredibly expressive and really skilled at spinning a narrative in a diary in particular. And Pennell's the same way. Some of the things that he writes, you're just like, oh my God, like I can see it when he talks about before the train arrives to take them to Christchurch, where they're going to break the news of Scott's death. He and Atkinson go and sit in a field together waiting for the train. And I just felt like I could see that, just the way that he describes it. I mean, he's a very vivid writer, at least, but, quite, an amateur. He's writing for his diary.
Yeah.
It's not like writing for publication, but he has this natural narrative sense that's so useful from a writer's perspective, or somebody that's going to do something with that material. I mean, he really builds the whole thing sort of for you. I think that's beautiful.
And as you're, writing the piece and coming together, and structuring it in a way that it really has that energy behind it.
Mm-hmm.
What did you find were some unique challenges as you were synthesizing it, as you're going back and forth with Jonah?
Yeah, well, let me tell you, the first draft of this was over double the length. I think I banged out 26,000 words in about 30 days of the first draft of this piece. And to give myself some grace there, that was the month after my father died, and it absolutely was a kind of coping mechanism, to write about somebody else's story of grief and of hardship. But I also was just incredibly familiar with every inch of this story at that point. And there was so much that I wanted to say. And I feel like I know these guys so well. And so it's hard from that vantage point, that closeness to a story, to step back and see what are other people actually going to care about. I feel sorry. I'm very apologetic to Jonah about it. And I feel bad that I gave him this huge honking draft to work with, but it just sort of poured out of me. So that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was cutting it down, because it felt like I felt like physical pain every time he would cut one of my favorite, but quite irrelevant bits. I think for me, one of the major things that got cut were, the fact that Pennell's diary, which is the main primary source, goes through this entire, almost year that they spend together back in England. And also there's a set of letters that are about when they're both going home on separate ships to England. And there's a lot of material there. I mean, he basically talks about what they do every single day. And so a lot of that had to get cut. And I just had to say, they did this and this and this and this. But some of the great moments that got cut there, like, when they're on these separate ships going home, they're writing to each other. And then Atkinson is escorting Oriana Wilson and her sister home on a steamer. And Oriana and her sister both wrote these long, long letters describing that voyage, which are so wonderful and vivid, just about Atkinson's personality seen from a different vantage point to Pennell's. And because we don't have a first person narrative from Atkinson, it was tough for me to cut that section, because I felt that section gave Atkinson so much more character and so much more color in terms of talking about how these two women saw him and how he acted on the ship, sort of out of a naval environment and out of the expedition environment, how he took some time to warm up to people and was very quiet, but all these girls at the table had crushes on him, and he was very charming, and he would sit with Oriana and they would like count all the birds because she missed her husband, who was a bird watcher who died on the expedition. Anyway, beautiful sequence, pretty much all cut except for one line.
And as you're synthesizing and generating the pages and the work, what were some of the passages or scenes that really jumped out at you that were so vibrant and kind of maybe even fun to write?
I think there are so many that could be their own little vignettes, like the scene where the ship is about to leave after dropping everybody off for the first time, and Atkinson has snow blindness because he's been out on the ice and he can't really see Pennell as he says goodbye to him. And they're about to spend a whole winter on the ice, and they don't know if they'll be there when the ship gets back. So it's a very touching moment, and the fact that Pennell, again, like feels the need to mention that in his journal. It's like he wishes that Atkinson could have seen him when they said goodbye. Like he feels like a pang, I think. And so that's a beautiful scene. And then there's a moment where further into the piece where the ship has come back and there's this whole snafu with one of the Lieutenant Evans is sick with scurvy, and Atkinson, doesn't know if he has to stay with him on the ship because he's so sick. And so they put the lieutenant on the ship, and suddenly Atkinson's on the ship for a couple days, just sort of keeping watch of this guy with scurvy, but he's there with Pennell as Pennell sails back and forth trying to rescue some other men. And Pennell says, well, this lieutenant is sick with scurvy, and my whole plan of coming in and staying with everybody on shore for the season is canceled because of that. But at least Atkinson is here now for these couple days on the ship, and I can spend this time with him. And he comes out and says that. It's wonderful to imagine Teddy Evans just sort of lying half dead with scurvy, being completely neglected by Atkinson, who just wants to spend all his time chatting with Pennell up on the bridge.
I think you illustrate well a kind of restlessness that is inherent to a lot of the men central to the story on the water and exploring and in charting the unknown. There is that restlessness at the heart of the story.
Yeah. And I mean, something that I regret I didn't really wasn't able to get into, because again, this is such a character-focused story, is how these men, were very, very active participants in imperialism, and they were enthusiastic, and they really saw it as their purpose. They were Navy men, they were in the sort of Imperial Navy, and that is what gave them a lot of that drive and purpose, that nationalism that thought that they're doing it for England. That's a really interesting thing to play against this very tender, very intimate love story. Is like, even these people that we tend to think of as, pawns in this larger story with a lot of atrocities and, a lot of really difficult stuff, even they were off, sort of having these romances that couldn't be fully spoken aloud. So how do you grapple with that as a writer and as a reader? Like, how do you interrogate that? And if I'm able to expand this into a larger project, that's something that I'm really looking forward to picking apart. How did the way that they felt about themselves as agents of imperialism factor into their perceived need to get married to women and, their need to be at the front and to be serving in this war? We have another character in this piece who's a conscientious objector, right? How did they relate to him in that state versus like Atkinson, for example's very enthusiastic participation in his wartime duties?
Yeah, there's that element too. As World War I is breaking out, like there is almost this hustle to want to participate and that's
unthinkable to readers today, right? It's one of these moments where the past seems very alien. You have these men who are having these quite familiar and understandable feelings of yearning and longing, and in the next sentence they're like, all I want to do is go to war, which is a mindset that I think for a lot of readers is going to seem quite foreign, and yet was very, very, very commonplace and even expected among the men of their generation.
What is it about the polar I can't even say the damn word. That like the polar exploration world that you find so appealing?
Well, again, it's that contrast between this incredibly alien and scary thing that they were doing and were so excited about doing, which is basically like flinging themselves into this cold void that, they didn't know whether they would come back or whether they would survive. They were so enthusiastic about exploration a lot of times because of this sort of element of nationalism. And they were doing these things that a lot of us can't imagine doing, like hauling hundreds of pounds of food through the ice and facing blizzards and scurvy and all this terrible and terrifying stuff. And at the same time, they were making their own little domestic world of friendship and loyalty and trust and sort of having these little human dramas that play out, sometimes quite petty, sometimes quite moving, in and amongst this incredibly alien context, right? So it's that contrast, that sort of the way those two elements play off of each other that I think is, for me, really, really fascinating and keeps me coming back. I mean, of course, there's a sort of inherent appeal to tales of daring do and adventure, but one of the things that I ran into when writing the story is the fact that the fact checker's like, well, we'll make sure we get the mileage right. How many miles did they have to go and what latitude were they were at? And that's something that a lot of readers of these kinds of works really care about is like who got how far and, what tools did they have. And I'm like, to be honest, I could care less. For me, it's about the people and about the emotions and about, the sort of human side of the story. And when I had to fact check like the mileage, I was like, I don't know,
Yeah.
I don't pay attention to that sort of thing.
I know. I know what you mean. Like I have a book coming out in a couple months about a very famous runner. And part of me, like as I was in the nauseating rereads and rewriting of the book, it's just like I would come across a time for a race. And it's like, oh my God, do I have this time right down to the 100th decimal point? Because there's going to be some running nerd out there who's like, no, it wasn't 351.3, it was 351.1.
Yeah.
Like, and you're a fraud, you fucking idiot. And it's just like, yeah. So that's kind of, I understand where you're coming from. I care more about the heartbeat, but there are some people out there, like if you get 1 decimal point wrong on a time or latitude, you're like, they call you a fraud.
I fully expect that to happen with this piece because I think we had to reach some kind of decision about using geographical miles versus nautical miles and, all this little fiddly stuff. But yeah, no, that's definitely a thing. But yeah, it's like a lot of the attention with Scott's expedition in particular has been about why did they die? Where were the failure points? Whose fault was it? And I hope that this story goes some way in towards presenting a sort of alternate canon where that question doesn't really matter, right? This sort of endless back and forth of articles in polar academic journals about like, well, was it Atkinson's fault? Was it Mears's fault? Was it Cherry's fault? Was it Teddy's fault? The fuel and the food and the this and the that. I'm like, well, let's do something different for a little while, actually, because there's so many other stories that should be told about, the people that were on this expedition and why they were there and what happened to them afterwards.
And through the course of, your body of work, but in particular this piece, do you like working with dead people versus living people?
Well, I love getting to interview subject matter experts and like people who were there. So that's one thing that I miss out on when I'm doing like these historical pieces. I love getting to talk to somebody who like really knows their stuff. And I've been doing a lot of that with my freelance pieces for National Geographic lately, which has been super fun. But at the same time, there's a particular joy associated with primary sources that I really, really, really love. My ideal, I think, piece would be something that mixes the two of those, right? Getting to really dig into the archives and then getting to go talk to an eyewitness or two or something like that. I'm reading a biography of Ernest Shackleton right now that was written in the 1950s. So they went, and he had died in the 1920s. So they go through all his diaries, but then they also talk to a bunch of people who were still alive at that time who knew him. And I like that mix a lot. And I think it presents, the possibility for different perspectives and, sort of raising certain questions about memory and stuff like that.
Yeah. And when you were, as you were getting into the more back and forth with Jonah in the rewriting, we talked about the drastic cuts that you needed to make. But throughout the restructuring and the reorganizing around that, what did you find to be, some of the other ancillary challenges that came across your desk?
Well, definitely fact checking, and that was my own fault because my sources were not in order. And then, there's so much amazing visual stuff, and I have no input as the writer into the sort of art direction of the piece. I wanted to make sure that they were supplied with image references, and then with fact checking, I think there were certain things, and this is very much the effect of having been at this research for almost 2 years, is that the fact checker would say, where's the source on this? And I would say, I just know that it's true. I read it somewhere, perhaps years ago. But luckily she was very, very patient. So trying to figure out how I knew what I knew, right?
Yeah.
And I'm really lucky that the members of the polar research community were super patient with my questions when I would go back to them for sources on things like, pronunciation and how did we know that this guy hated this other guy again? And, so everyone is super, super generous with their time and with their resources. So, this piece absolutely could not have existed without the collaboration of a whole research community of really enthusiastic people.
And I love in looking at your website too. It's almost got like a kind of a circus like feel to it.
Yeah, it's based off of 19th century woodblock printing.
Yeah, it's great, and it really illustrates, I think, the wide swath of what it means to kind of be a working writer these days. You know, just the the degree to which you have to diversify all those things. As much as we might want to write 4 or 5 long features a year and call that a career, that'd be awesome. But those days are done.
Yeah.
But so just for you, I think a lot of people out there who listen to the show, they like to get a sense of how a writer makes a living. So how have you started to just cultivated that for yourself through different revenue channels, be it journalism or
Sure.
sometimes even like content work?
Yeah. I mean, it's quite hard, and I'll be completely transparent. I have accepted a full-time role beginning 10th, which I'm super, super excited about. But that's going to be my first full-time role in journalism. It was quite a journey to achieve, and it only came on the heels of, the last couple of years of really, really intense freelance work and pitching and, finding places for myself in the field. I was lucky. I started off with a part-time position at the social media platform Tumblr while I went to grad school. And then while I was doing both of those things, I also started building my freelance portfolio with collaborating with some Substack writers on, placing, I had regular columns and would place stuff with them. Those had a pretty wide readership, and that got me the attention of a book editor, which through a long process is how I ended up getting my agent and my deal for my first book, which is still forthcoming, still working on that. But then once I had that, I could start saying, well, I'm about to be a book author, and putting that in my sort of slug for the pitch is a pretty good thing. And so I started getting more freelance work and sort of building up on that.
If you had a good idea, how often were you pitching that? How many outlets might you be pitching it to? How did you kind of keep the momentum of it going in case it was turned down? And you just like keep it out, keep it going.
Yeah, that's a tricky question, just because while I was doing a lot of this pitching, I was also working on my book manuscript or doing other freelance work. So I would try to pitch at least a couple times a week. I mean, there's like the amount of volume that you have to put out for pitching to like maintain a steady flow of pieces is pretty crazy. And I think sometimes I would, get distracted with other work and then suddenly realize like I had sent out no pitches and then I would have no work. So it was definitely a challenge. But I think, sorry, I'm pulling up my data because for the last 2 years I've tracked how many pitches I send and how many articles that I wrote. So in 2023, which was my first full-time year of freelance writing, I sent 55 pitches and I had 27 accepted and 23 published. And then in 2024, surprisingly didn't do much better. I had 107 pitches sent and only 31 accepted and only 25 or 28 published. So they did very, because a lot of that in 2023, I had some steady editors and then who left their positions, and I had to really start from scratch in 2024. But also in 2024, I accomplished, I had bylines in 9 new publications, and I made relationships with new editors. And I was published in some prestige outlets, which I was pretty proud of. So, you win some, you lose some. It's really hard to be a freelance writer.
Oh, for sure. And it's such a numbers game. And I feel like you sharing those numbers is really helpful because people just don't know what the batting average is. And I would say like you've got a pretty good batting average there on that alone. I would say like even a normal batting average is far, far lower too, at least in my experience. So it's just like, if we talk about those numbers, then when people get, 8 rejections out of 10, they're not going to feel as shitty. They'll be like, oh, I'm on pace. That's fine. Instead of feeling like, oh my God, I'm such a failure.
And also part of it is some of those pitches last year, I would send them in bulk, like mini pitches to editors that I had a good working relationship with. So they wouldn't even progress to like the full, fully written out pitch stage. The editor would just say, no, I'm not interested in that idea. And it would save me a lot of time and energy. And also that number of total pitches sent went up because I did start multi-pitching and like sending pitches to multiple outlets at the same time, which I don't think I'd really done the year before that, but like just out of necessity. Like I can't wait to hear back from one before sending to the other, because some places can take ages to get back to you, even if you know the editor.
Mm. And bringing it back to your Atavist piece, when now that it's ready to go out into the world and be consumed, what are you hoping people take away from it, from all the work, all the cutting you did, all the reporting and research? What are you hoping resonates with people the most?
Yeah. Well, that is a great question, because I have been thinking of nothing else for like the past year as I've been working on this piece. Like, let me remind you, I pitched it last February and it's finally coming out. I have been thinking, I just want people to cry. My fact checker said she cried. My mom was like very emotional when she read it. And I'm like, I want people to get sad, because sadness, at least when you're reading something like this, to me, is a form of enthusiasm. Like, you're feeling something. You're really like, moved. I want people to be moved because it's a story that really moved me. And beyond that, I want to show people that polar exploration is an area of history where there are so many stories like this. There are so many like deeply emotional stories of friendship and connection and loyalty and tragedy. And if this piece can get some people who've never picked up about a book about polar exploration to pick up a book about polar exploration, I will be very, very happy. I want to send people down that rabbit hole, down that funnel. And at the bottom of it, there's this amazing community where you will, be welcomed.
Yeah, I think last year I had, I'm blanking on the author's name, but I'll make sure I splice that in. But he released the Battle of Ink and Ice.
Daryl Hartman.
There we go. Yeah, he was on the show last year for that book. And it's just another one of those great books that it deals with, well, that one had a lot to do with newspaper rivalries and exploration. Mm-hmm. But it's just like, it's such a weird, wonderful subculture that's so well documented because everyone kept these amazing journals for the most part.
Yeah. And also they were like, like celebrities. They were the rock stars of their day. There's so much, like I did a lot of research in newspaper archives for this story because, after they returned and there was this terrible tragedy that was headline news, like they gave interviews. And so like, that's another voice to be put to use in a story like this. Battle of Ink and Ice is a great book, and it's also a great example of the way that polar history intersects with sort of communications and print history and print culture, which is, like I said, another one of my big nerd areas. So I really liked that book.
Nice. Well, Allegra, when I close down these conversations or bring them down for a landing, I love asking for you for a recommendation for the listeners out there. And that's just like anything you're excited about that's making you happy that you're like, oh, yeah, I want to share that. This brand of socks or this fanny pack. Whatever you like.
Yeah. Knitting. All I have been doing basically lately while I wait for this new job to start is knitting. And I highly recommend getting into knitting if you're the kind of person that always finds yourself scrolling through your phone while watching TV. It's a great way to wean yourself off of that second screen and sort of stop scrolling, because you have to have your little knitting counter app open on your phone. So you can't look at anything else. You're watching TV, you're knitting, you're sort of at peace, you're engaging your fine motor skills. And at the end of it, you got a cute hat. So strongly recommend knitting for all of the sort of unmedicated ADHD people out there. As one, I can tell you that it's a really great sort of tool to calm the mind and to center yourself and to get in the zone and stop looking at your phone.
Oh, I love it, Allegra. That's wonderful. So, awesome. Well, thank you so much for this incredible Atavist story you've written and for carving out some time to talk some shop on the show about it. So thanks, Allegra.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so excited for everybody to read this story. I am super, super proud of it. I'm getting emotional just thinking of, how long of a process this has been and how ready I am to see it out in the world. So thank you so much for having me.
Sweet. Yes. Big thanks to Jonah and Allegra for their time. Remember to consider subscribing to the Atavist, magazine.atavist.com. Pre-order The Frontrunner. And consider the Power of Narrative Conference in a month's time. CNF 15 to get a nice little discount. Visit combeyond.bu.edu. It's only a month away. Okay, so listen. I've long thought about how I can renovate the interior of this podcast. Anytime I do it, I tend to get a little bit lazy and just don't. I've long admired how Rishikesh Hirway of Song Exploder edits his episodes. If you haven't listened to that podcast or haven't heard of it, it's great. He features a musician, be it John Baptiste or Metallica, and he clearly interviews them about how they construct a song. So they kind of deconstruct a song that they have coming out, and then they kind of layer it and put it together, and they basically narrate how they think their way through the construction of a song. And Rishikesh pretty much edits himself out of the entire final cut. He's rarely in there. Episodes are always under 30 minutes, and I think that's a real sweet spot to get to. Like, I'm almost beginning to think asking for an hour of someone's time is rude. Say nothing of the north of hour, 90 minutes, 2-hour podcasts out there. Like, I ain't got time for that. I was thinking how to energize the show a bit. And that might mean getting brutal with the edit. Like, if I find myself drifting off at all, or like just kind of drifting during the edit, that's probably a good sign I should cut it. And I can't and ah my way to a tight edit. You know, I cut 90% of those out, so it's a better listen on the ear. But that's like trimming the passive voice into active voice and hoping to cut large swaths of your manuscript. Like, you got to take a chainsaw to the manuscript to really cut things down. It's got to be the great stuff, like the really great stuff, or it goes. And it's not an insult to the guest. I've long thought that if you spend an hour with me, we're gonna keep most of that hour. Like, if I speak to someone like an Isabel Wilkerson or Ta-Nehisi Coates, like, how do I cut that down to 30 minutes from 60? You'd be a monster, but I think maybe I should. I listened to a conversation with Hanif Abdurraqib, who's previously on the show, on Song Exploder, and it was 30 minutes, and I felt like that was enough. It was really good. I'm guessing it was close to an hour of raw tape, and the edit brought it down to just the gold. And you wouldn't think of leaving the fat on a piece of writing, and many, many, many podcasts have a lot of fat to lose. Many of mine do, despite my editing. So I'm going to try to see what happens when I get savage with an edit. Problem is, we talk about, on a particular episode, we talk about the book at hand or the article or essay, and we also talk about process and craft, and that can get long and wordy, probably enough for 2 episodes. But I think I can make a tighter product that is not as bloated, but it still has what you love in a fraction of the time. So that's going to be my goal. I'm not going to try to take too big of a bite of that apple, but I am going to get really, really tight about the editing. We'll see if it sticks, because sometimes all I want to do is clip out the verbal tics and move on with my day. And I'd welcome your feedback, so you can email the show, creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. You can let me know what you think. If you'd like it a little bit tighter, so long as it doesn't sacrifice the material that you've come to enjoy from the show. I think I can deliver the same thing and maybe make it 15 minutes shorter. Ideally 30, but let's not get greedy. All right? So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya!